December 16th, 1916. A cellar beneath a palace on the Moika River in St. Petersburg. On the table, a plate of pastries, laced with enough cyanide to kill 5 men. The man eating them doesn't know that. He trusts the young prince sitting across from him, the same prince who invited him here tonight with the promise of meeting his beautiful wife. He eats one cake, then another, then a third. Nothing happens. The prince, sweating now, glancing at the clock, offers him a glass of wine, also poisoned. He drinks it, then asks for another. Upstairs, the other conspirators wait with a loaded revolver, growing more terrified by the minute. Because the man in the cellar, the one who should already be dead, is still talking, still laughing, still somehow very much alive. Within the hour, they will shoot him. Multiple times. And he will still get back up. This is not a horror story. This actually happened to one of the most feared and misunderstood men in Russian history. His name was Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin. A Siberian peasant with almost no formal education who somehow became the closest confidant of an empress, the whispered ruler of an empire, and, depending on who you ask, either a holy healer or the man who helped destroy the 300-year Romanov dynasty. And strangest of all, before any of the men in that cellar ever laid a hand on him, Rasputin himself had already written down, in his own words, exactly how he believed his death would unfold and what it would mean for the family he served. We'll come back to that letter because it may be the eeriest detail in this entire story. To understand why 5 powerful men felt they had to poison, shoot, and drown him just to make sure he stayed dead, you have to go back nearly 50 years to a muddy village in the middle of Siberia where nobody could have imagined any of this was coming. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born in 1869 in a village called Pokrovskoye on the banks of the Tura River in western Siberia. It was about as far from a royal palace as you could get. No roads worth the name, no schools worth the name. Winters that could kill a man who wasn't careful, and summers spent farming land that barely gave enough back to survive on. His father, Yefim, was a peasant farmer and sometime coachman, respectable enough by village standards, but nothing close to wealthy. Grigori grew up one of several children, though most of his siblings died young, a grim but common reality in rural Siberia at the time, where disease and hard winters took a heavy toll on children long before they reached adulthood. Losing 2 brothers in childhood left a mark on him that people close to him noticed for the rest of his life, a kind of restless fixation on death, and on what, if anything, waited on the other side of it. Rasputin never learned to read or write properly as a child. By most accounts, he was seen as a difficult kid, restless, prone to fits of anger, occasionally violent. Some villagers later claimed he'd been a horse thief in his youth, though that's one of many stories about him that's impossible to fully confirm, and some historians suspect it may have been added later, once Rasputin was already famous, to make his origin story sound more dramatic. There's one story from this period that villagers repeated for years afterward, that as a teenager, Rasputin was somehow able to identify which horse in a group had been stolen simply by walking down the line and studying each animal at a moment when local peasants were arguing furiously over a theft. Whether that story is true, exaggerated, or invented after the fact to explain his later reputation is impossible to know. But it's exactly the kind of tale that started following him around the region, strange, hard to verify, and just plausible enough that people kept repeating it. At 19, he married a woman named Praskovia Dubrovina from a neighboring village. By most accounts, Praskovia was steady, devoted, and largely uninterested in the world of politics and mysticism her husband would eventually be swallowed by. Together, they would have several children, though, again, in keeping with the harsh realities of rural Siberian life. Only 3 survived into adulthood: a son, Dmitry, and 2 daughters, Maria and Varvara. For a while, Rasputin lived the ordinary life of a Siberian peasant farmer, working the land, raising his family, blending into a village most of Russia would never hear of. What we do know is that something changed in his 20s. Rasputin claimed to have had a religious vision. The Virgin Mary, he said, appeared to him while he was out working in the fields. Some accounts suggest the change came after a personal crisis, a period of illness, or grief following the deaths of some of his children that pushed him toward faith in a way that hadn't gripped him before. Whatever actually happened, it sent him on a different path entirely. He left his village and began wandering, first to a nearby monastery at Verkhoturye, a place already famous across Siberia for its relics and its miracle stories, then further on pilgrimages across Russia and eventually to Greece and Jerusalem. He wasn't a monk in any official sense. He never took vows. He was something Russia had a specific word for: a stranik, a wandering holy man, half pilgrim and half mystic, living off the charity of villagers in exchange for prayers, blessings, and spiritual guidance. He would disappear from Pokrovskoye for months, sometimes years at a time, then return, changed a little more each time, thinner, more intense, with stranger and more vivid stories of what he'd seen on the road. His own wife, when later asked by curious visitors whether it bothered her that her husband spent so little time at home, reportedly just shrugged and said there was enough of him to go around, a strange, almost resigned kind of acceptance that would echo through the rest of his life. Russia in the late 1800s was full of these figures. Most of them stayed obscure, moving from village to village, forgotten within a generation. Rasputin did not stay obscure. He had something the others didn't, a kind of magnetism people struggled to describe. Visitors who met him for the first time often mentioned his eyes before anything else: pale, deep-set, and, according to more than one account, almost impossible to look away from. He also claimed the ability to heal the sick, calm the anxious, and see into the future. And slowly, word of the Siberian holy man began to spread beyond Siberia, first to regional churchmen, then to bishops, then all the way to St. Petersburg itself. One of the first influential figures to take a genuine interest in him was a churchman named Bishop Feofan, a respected theologian at the St. Petersburg Theological Academy. Feofan was, by all accounts, no fool and no easy mark for a con artist. He was one of the most educated religious minds in the empire. And yet, after meeting Rasputin, he became convinced the man possessed something genuine, an unusual spiritual depth that couldn't easily be explained away. Feofan's endorsement mattered enormously. It was, in effect, a stamp of legitimacy from inside the religious establishment, and it's a large part of why doors that should have stayed shut to an uneducated Siberian peasant instead swung open. By 1903, Rasputin had arrived in the capital of the Russian Empire, a city of palaces, ballrooms, and imperial guards. And somehow, within just a few years, this barely literate Siberian peasant would be walking its most private hallways as a trusted guest. St. Petersburg's high society had a peculiar hunger at the turn of the century, a fascination with mysticism, spiritualism, faith healers, and holy men even among the most educated aristocrats. Seances, fortune tellers, and traveling mystics were, for a certain slice of the Russian elite, practically a fashionable pastime. Into that atmosphere walked a man who didn't dress like an aristocrat, didn't speak like one, and made almost no effort to. He wore plain peasant clothes, had unkempt hair and a long beard, and spoke in a rough, unpolished Siberian dialect, peppering his sentences with blunt, sometimes crude folk sayings. To some in the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg, that rawness read as embarrassing. To others, it read as authenticity, proof that this was a real holy man, untouched by the corrupting polish of the capital. Rasputin was introduced into these circles through a pair of well-connected sisters, the Grand Duchesses Militsa and Anastasia, who were themselves deeply interested in mysticism and had been searching for a genuine holy man to bring into the royal family's orbit. They found their man in Rasputin. And in 1905, they introduced him to Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Empress Alexandra. At first, he was simply one of several religious figures the royal couple entertained out of curiosity and piety. Nicholas even noted the meeting briefly in his diary, a passing mention of an interesting man of God from Tobolsk province, nothing that suggested he understood what this relationship would eventually become. Nothing that would have marked him out as different from the dozen other wandering monks and mystics passing through the capital that year. Then in 1908, everything changed because of a secret the Romanov family was desperately trying to protect. Their only son, Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the entire Russian throne, had hemophilia, a blood disorder that meant even a minor bump or cut could trigger internal bleeding that wouldn't stop. At the time, hemophilia was essentially a death sentence delivered in slow motion. There was no real treatment. Doctors could do almost nothing beyond waiting and hoping. The condition had entered the Romanov bloodline through Alexandra herself, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Britain, whose family carried the hemophilia gene through several branches of European royalty. Alexandra knew, with agonizing clarity, exactly where the illness had come from and carried a private guilt about it for the rest of her life. The Romanovs kept the diagnosis a closely guarded secret. An heir with a fatal, incurable illness was not something an empire built on strength and dynasty wanted the public, or its enemies, to know about. Even most of the extended royal family and government ministers were kept in the dark about how serious Alexei's condition truly was. Nicholas and Alexandra even went so far as to hide it from most of their own relatives, terrified that word would reach rival branches of the family who might use it to challenge Alexei's claim to the throne. During one of Alexei's episodes, a bleeding crisis so severe that doctors reportedly believed the boy might die, Empress Alexandra, out of desperation, sent for Rasputin. Nowhere was that desperation more visible than in the autumn of 1912 at the Royal Hunting Lodge of Spawa in what is now Poland. Alexei, then 8 years old, had been jolted hard during a carriage ride over rough terrain. Within hours, internal bleeding had started in his groin and thigh. Within days, the bleeding had spread so severely that a tumor-like mass formed under the skin, and the boy was in agony so constant he could barely sleep. Alexandra stayed at his bedside almost around the clock, according to those present, her own health visibly breaking down under the strain of watching her son suffer without being able to do anything about it. Court attendants later described the sound of Alexei's screaming echoing through the halls of the lodge at night, and Alexandra sitting beside him for hours, unable to offer anything more than her presence. Doctors examined him and, one by one, quietly admitted there was nothing more they could do. A bulletin announcing Alexei's impending death was reportedly drafted, ready to be released to the public. A priest was brought in to perform last rites. Alexandra, in her panic, sent a telegram to Rasputin, who was back in his home village in Siberia at the time, thousands of miles away. His reply came back short and strange. That God had seen her tears and heard her prayers, and that the boy would not die, and that she should stop letting the doctors bother him so much. Within a day of that telegram arriving, according to multiple accounts from people present at Spawa, Alexei's bleeding began to slow. Within a few more days, he was recovering. To Alexandra, there was no mystery here at all. Rasputin, from thousands of miles away, without ever touching her son, had saved his life. Whether it was coincidence, the natural course of the bleeding finally stopping on its own, or something else entirely, is something historians still argue about. What's not up for argument is what it did to Alexandra's mind. From that point forward, in her eyes, Rasputin wasn't simply a comfort or an advisor. He was the one thread standing between her son and death. And a mother's desperation to save her only son gave one Siberian peasant a level of access to the Russian throne that dukes, generals, and bishops spent entire careers trying and failing to get. Much of that access ran through one particular woman, Anna Vyrubova, Empress Alexandra's closest friend and lady-in-waiting. Vyrubova had become a devoted believer in Rasputin years earlier, and she served, in effect, as the bridge between the Siberian mystic and the private world of the royal family, arranging meetings, passing along messages, and vouching for him whenever anyone at court raised doubts. In 1915, Vyrubova was badly injured in a train crash, so badly that doctors initially believed she wouldn't survive the night. Rasputin was brought to her bedside, and after praying over her, reportedly declared that she would live, but would be crippled for the rest of her life. She survived, walking afterward only with the aid of crutches or a cane, and the prediction, half miracle and half curse, only deepened the reputation that had already made him seem untouchable by ordinary explanation. For a while, Rasputin's presence in the royal household stayed relatively private. But privacy is not something you get to keep for long when you're advising an empress. As his access to the palace deepened, Rasputin's life outside it grew stranger and more contradictory. By day, he might be received in the private rooms of the empress herself, treated with the reverence due a holy man. By night, he was often found in the restaurants and private rooms of St. Petersburg, drinking heavily, surrounded by admirers, many of them wealthy, fashionable women who had become devoted followers, convinced that closeness to Rasputin brought them closer to God. The Russian secret police, the Okhrana, eventually assigned agents to monitor him, in part for his own protection, given the growing number of enemies he'd accumulated, and in part because the government itself wanted to know exactly what he was doing and who he was meeting. Their surveillance reports, many of which survive today, describe a chaotic, contradictory life, long nights of drinking and socializing, followed by mornings spent receiving petitioners, ordinary Russians who lined up outside his apartment, hoping the holy man might help them get a government job, a legal favor, or simply a blessing. Some of these petitioners left with genuine help, a letter of introduction, a word put in with the right official. Others, according to several accounts, were asked for favors of a very different kind in return, particularly if they were women, one of the darkest and most disputed threads in the enormous tangle of claims made about him then and since. Rumors began circulating almost immediately, some true, many wildly exaggerated. That Rasputin was part of a secretive, unorthodox religious sect called the Klisti, known for controversial rituals that blurred the line between spiritual ecstasy and physical indulgence, a connection Rasputin always denied, and one the Orthodox Church itself investigated at least twice without ever formally proving. That he drank heavily and had numerous affairs, sometimes flaunting his access to the royal family to seduce women in St. Petersburg society. that he was, in fact, the empress's lover. A claim almost certainly false, but one that spread through the capital like wildfire, precisely because it was scandalous and impossible to disprove. One of the loudest voices spreading these accusations was a former ally turned bitter enemy, a monk named Iliador, who had once been close to Rasputin but later turned against him completely, publishing lurid accusations and even reportedly plotting violence against him. In 1914, a woman connected to Iliador's circle, a former prostitute named Kionia Guseva, whose nose had reportedly been disfigured by untreated syphilis, approached Rasputin outside his home in Pokrovskoye and stabbed him in the stomach, screaming that she had killed the Antichrist. The wound was severe enough that Rasputin's intestines were reportedly visible, and doctors performing emergency surgery believed for a time that he might not survive. He recovered, slowly, over the following weeks, but the attack was an early, brutal sign of just how much hatred had built up around him, years before the men in that St. Petersburg cellar ever began planning his death. By the 1910s, newspapers were openly mocking him. Cartoons depicted him as a puppet master pulling the strings of a helpless royal family. And then, in 1914, World War I broke out, and Rasputin's influence went from scandalous to genuinely dangerous. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He left St. Petersburg to personally command Russian troops at the front. That left Empress Alexandra effectively in charge of running the government back home. And Alexandra trusted almost no one's judgment more than Rasputin's. What followed became known, half-mockingly, as ministerial leapfrog, a dizzying, chaotic churn of appointments and dismissals at the very top of the Russian government, with Rasputin's name attached to nearly all of it. In the letters Alexandra sent almost daily to Nicholas at the front, letters historians have pored over for over a century, she referred to Rasputin simply as "our friend," and repeated his opinions on ministers and policy as though they carried the weight of scripture. In one letter, she urged Nicholas to listen to our friend's advice on a military matter, insisting that his intuition had never once failed them. In another, she pushed for the dismissal of a minister she felt had been disrespectful toward Rasputin, treating a personal grudge as a matter of state importance. When Alexandra pushed to have the aging Prime Minister Ivan Goromykin replaced in 1916, our friend was cited as having approved the change, and Boris Sturmer, a man widely viewed as mediocre and largely unqualified, was installed in his place, in part because Alexandra believed him more sympathetic to Rasputin's influence. Sturmer lasted only a few months before he too was pushed out, replaced by Alexander Trepov, who himself lasted barely 2 months before being forced out as well. When Alexander Protopopov, a man many in government considered mentally unstable and wildly unqualified, was appointed interior minister, one of the most powerful positions in the empire, it was widely believed in St. Petersburg that Rasputin himself had personally recommended him. Whether or not Rasputin's actual political influence was as vast as the rumors claimed, and historians still argue about exactly how much power he really had. What mattered was that the public believed it was vast. 4 different men held the position of prime minister in barely 18 months. Ministers who had spent decades earning their positions were removed within weeks of appointment, seemingly on the word of a Siberian peasant, with no formal office and no legal authority whatsoever. And a nation exhausted by war, food shortages, and mounting casualties needed someone to blame. They found their target in a barely literate Siberian mystic who was, by nearly every account, now the second most powerful person in the Russian Empire. In November of 1916, one of the men who would later help kill him, the Duma deputy Vladimir Purishkevich, stood up in front of the entire Russian parliament and delivered a blistering hours-long speech naming Rasputin directly, accusing him of dragging the monarchy toward ruin and demanding he be removed from the palace by any means necessary. The speech electrified the chamber. Copies of it circulated through St. Petersburg within days, read aloud in officers' clubs and aristocratic drawing rooms alike. Sitting in the gallery that night, listening to every word, was a young prince named Felix Yusupov, who would, within weeks, turn Purishkevich's public outrage into a private and very literal plan. And this is where that letter comes back in. Sometime in the weeks before his death, Rasputin reportedly wrote a letter addressed to the Tsar himself, which was said to lay out a chilling prediction. If he were killed by ordinary peasants or common criminals, he wrote, the Tsar and his family would go on to rule Russia for centuries. But if he were killed by nobles, by members of the aristocracy, people close to the throne itself, then, he warned, none of the Romanov family would survive longer than 2 years. The authenticity of this letter has been disputed by historians for decades. Some believe it's genuine. Others believe it was invented or embellished after the fact, once the prophecy had already eerily come true. What's not disputed is the outcome. Rasputin was killed by nobles, a prince, a Grand Duke, and a member of parliament. And less than 17 months later, every single member of the Romanov family he served was dead. By late 1916, a small circle of aristocrats had come to a chilling conclusion. The only way to save the monarchy, and they believed Russia itself, was to remove Rasputin permanently. This brings us back to that cellar. The plan was assembled over several weeks by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, married to the Tsar's own niece, along with Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin, and Vladimir Purishkevich, the same Duma deputy whose speech had just set the capital on fire. 2 more men joined to help carry it out, a military officer named Sergei Sokotin and a doctor, Stanislav Lazovert, who supplied the poison. Yusupov had spent weeks carefully cultivating a friendship with Rasputin beforehand, visiting him under the pretense of seeking treatment for a nervous illness, slowly earning his trust he intended to use exactly once. By his own later account, Yusupov found the process deeply unsettling, sitting across from a man he was actively planning to murder, listening to him talk about God, about healing, about the royal family he loved, all while quietly working out how the killing itself would unfold. On the night of December 16, 1916, Yusupov personally drove to Rasputin's apartment and brought him to the Moika Palace, using the promise of finally meeting Yusupov's wife, Princess Irina, as the lure. In reality, Irina wasn't even in the city that night. Upstairs, the other conspirators played a gramophone record on loop, hoping the sound of music and voices would convince Rasputin a small party really was happening somewhere in the house. Downstairs, in a cellar room, Yusupov had furnished specifically for the occasion, filled with rugs, ornaments, and a small fireplace to make it feel like an intimate sitting room rather than what it actually was. Cakes laced with potassium cyanide sat waiting on a tray. Rasputin ate several. Nothing happened. He drank wine, also poisoned. Still, nothing happened. Historians still debate exactly why the poison seemingly failed. Some suggest the cyanide had degraded, or that Rasputin, who reportedly avoided sweets and drank in moderation that particular night, simply didn't ingest a lethal dose. Yusupov later described sitting across from Rasputin during this stretch of time, making conversation, watching for any sign of distress, while quietly panicking that the entire plan was falling apart in front of him. At one point, According to Yusupov's account, Rasputin even asked him to sing or to play the guitar, seemingly completely at ease, utterly unaware of what was sitting on the plate in front of him. Whatever the reason, roughly 2.5 hours after the poisoning began, an increasingly desperate Yusupov went upstairs, retrieved a revolver, came back down, and shot Rasputin in the chest at close range. Rasputin collapsed. The conspirators, believing him finally dead, went upstairs to make final arrangements, and, according to Purishkevich's own later diary, to allow themselves a brief, relieved drink, certain the ordeal was finally over. And then, according to Yusupov's own later account, Rasputin, bleeding, supposedly already shot through the chest, opened his eyes, got back to his feet, and ran out into the palace courtyard, trying to escape over the fence toward the street. Purishkevich, hearing the commotion, grabbed a pistol and chased him down across the snow-covered courtyard, firing twice more and finally striking him from behind. This time, Rasputin went down and stayed down. The conspirators bound his body, drove it to the frozen Neva River, and pushed it through a hole in the ice, where, according to the traditional account, he finally drowned. That's the story Yusupov told for the rest of his life, published years later in his own memoirs, and it's the version that made Rasputin into legend, the man who couldn't be killed. But a modern forensic review of the surviving autopsy photographs tells a somewhat different story. Evidence of a close-contact gunshot wound to Rasputin's forehead suggests he may have already been dead, or at least dying, before he ever reached the river. Meaning the most famous detail of the entire legend, that Rasputin drowned, still alive, after surviving poison and 3 bullets, may have been exaggerated or invented outright by the very man who killed him to cement his own place in history. We may never know with certainty which version is true. What we do know is this. Rasputin's body was pulled from the Neva River several days later, on December 19th, wrapped in ice, one arm reportedly raised, as though he had still been struggling even in his final moments. Empress Alexandra was devastated. She had lost the one man she believed could keep her son alive. She arranged for Rasputin to be buried in secret on the grounds of the royal estate at Tsarskoye Selo, with only a small handful of people present. Nicholas, informed of the murder while still away from the capital, hurried home and reportedly said only that no one had the right to kill, a quiet, almost weary response to the death of a man who had done more than perhaps anyone to destabilize his own reign. It didn't stay secret, and it didn't stay peaceful. When revolution swept through Russia only weeks later, in February 1917, revolutionary soldiers reportedly dug up Rasputin's body and burned it in a nearby forest, erasing any physical trace of the man who had once stood at the center of Russian power. Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry were exiled from Russia for their role in the murder, a punishment far lighter than what most conspirators against a royal favorite might have expected, in part because so many in Russian high society quietly considered them heroes. Newspapers across Europe treated the killing almost as good news, proof, many believed, that Russia might finally be freeing itself from the mystic's grip in time to save the war effort and the monarchy alike. But killing Rasputin didn't save the monarchy the conspirators believed they were protecting. Within 3 months, food riots and strikes in the capital spiraled into full revolution. Within a year, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. Within 17 months of Rasputin's death, almost exactly as the disputed letter had warned, Nicholas, Alexandra, Alexei, and his 4 sisters were executed by revolutionary forces in a cellar in the city of Yekaterinburg. The dynasty Rasputin had spent a decade whispering into the ear of was gone completely, and so, in a way, was the very empire he'd become the most hated symbol of. Rasputin's own family scattered in the chaos that followed. His daughter Maria eventually fled Russia entirely, living for a time in Paris and later in the United States, where she worked, at different points, as a cabaret dancer and even briefly as a lion tamer in a traveling circus, an almost unbelievable final chapter for the daughter of Russia's most infamous mystic. In 1928, after Yusupov published his memoirs detailing the murder in vivid, almost boastful detail, Maria sued him in a Paris court seeking damages for her father's death. The case was ultimately dismissed on a legal technicality. French courts ruled they had no jurisdiction over a killing that had taken place on Russian soil, but the lawsuit itself became a public spectacle, keeping Rasputin's name in newspapers on 2 continents more than a decade after his death. In the decades since, Rasputin has become one of the most instantly recognizable figures from that entire period of history, endlessly reimagined in films, books, and popular culture, almost always as some version of the same archetype, the sinister, hypnotic mystic who could not be killed. Much of that image traces directly back to one single source, Yusupov's own dramatic retelling of that night in the cellar, which means the most famous version of Rasputin the world remembers may, in a strange twist, be largely the creation of the very man who murdered him. So, who was Grigori Rasputin really? To Empress Alexandra, he was the only man capable of saving her dying son, a genuine holy healer sent by God at her most desperate hour. To the Russian public, he became something closer to a monster, a symbol of everything corrupt and rotten inside a crumbling empire, a drunken mystic manipulating a weak-willed royal family into ruin. To modern historians, he's neither of those things. He's something far more complicated, a barely literate Siberian peasant whose genuine gift for reading people, combined with one family's desperate love for a dying child, briefly made him one of the most powerful unelected men in the history of Europe. Whether Rasputin truly held the power he was accused of, or whether he became a scapegoat for problems already tearing the Russian Empire apart from within, is still argued over by historians more than a century later. What's not in dispute is this. A group of powerful men were so afraid of him, they didn't think one method of killing him would be enough. And even now, over 100 years after that night in the cellar, no one can agree on exactly how he died, or how a peasant from a village most Russians had never heard of ever got close enough to an empire's throne to make that killing feel necessary. That uncertainty, more than almost anything else, is exactly why Grigori Rasputin has never really left our imagination.